Now, I got to tell you, you're all about to be in for a real treat with JT. I saw him on stage for the first time closing out last year's Skepticon, of which he's a founding creator and organizer. Talk about powerful. Such depth, such emotion. This past February, I saw him again, for a second time, speaking before a packed house at the American Atheists National Convention. I was standing in the very back, and as I was commenting about him to a friend, who else but David Silverman himself walked up to me and said, "Please be quiet, JT's speaking and your voice is echoing on the back wall." The very next day, I caught JT in the hallway and I said, "Man, how the hell do you do that without a single page of notes?" JT is an absolute talent who's worked extensively with the Secular Student Alliance and is author of the wildly popular blog, What Would JT Do? I can't say enough about JT. He can't sit still. He refuses to be quiet. And we all benefit from his energy and all of his off-the-charts insights. If he's not kicking ass with a microphone, he's entertaining you with magic tricks or beautiful lyrics from a Shakespearean opera. You don't take on JT Eberhard and walk away unscathed, that's for damn sure. He's also an equal opportunity destroyer of myth and fantastical foolishness, who will soon be embarking on a mission to New Zealand to prove, beyond a shadow of doubt, that despite over a decade of eyewitness sightings and testimony from the citizens of that beautiful country, there are no such things as hobbits or orcs. Please welcome one of the most powerful voices in the secular community, both singing and speaking, JT Eberhard!
Test. Is this thing working? You maybe?
You gotta turn it down.
It's a tech thing.
It says on. Oh no, okay. 7 years of college. I know. I was initially thinking I didn't want to follow Lauren. Now I don't want to follow Sky. My name is JT Eberhard. I write the blog Sky talked about. Fixed it. Okay. Originally, Sky asked me to come here and speak, and he said, but we don't want to bash other people's beliefs too much. And I think I said, why are you inviting me? Because that's pretty much what I do. So we agreed on a topic, which is the consequences of unreason. Why should people be reasonable? What happens when they don't? Most of you who have seen me speak know that I like to give jovial, happy talks, and I'm about to really disappoint you, and I'm sorry for that. I want to open by talking about this girl. Her name is Madeleine Newman. Several years ago, she became incredibly sick, to the point of skin turning blue, breath getting shallow, just incredible pain, lying on the floor of her parents' room, or her parents' house. And this went on for a couple weeks until finally she died of type 1 diabetes, completely treatable disease. And at no point did her parents summon an ambulance. Now, everybody in this room knows why. Because her parents believed in the power of prayer. And they believed that if they prayed hard enough, and if they didn't tempt or test the Lord's will by taking her to a hospital, that the Lord would make her better. And eventually, Madeleine died. That's what happens when people pray and don't take someone to the doctor. Now, if the word bad is to have any meaningful definition, parents who watch and do nothing while their child dies are bad. They're monsters. But when I read this story, there was something that stuck out to me, and it was how similar I was to those parents. Because those parents loved their daughter as much as you and I would love our children. They wanted their daughter to get well as much as any of us would want our children to get well. The fault with these parents wasn't, as Christianity would have us believe, that there's something inherently wrong or malicious about humanity. The problem was just that they had a bad idea about how the universe works. And all the good intentions in the world were not enough to save them once that happened. So what does that tell us? It tells us that if we have good intentions, which honestly I think is most people on the planet, religious, unreligious, we all want good things to happen. If we have good intentions, we have a moral obligation, not only to ourselves, but to everybody with whom we share this planet, to try to be as reasonable as possible, to ensure that our good intentions are borne out in reality. Now, once you accept that, we can start looking at examples of the the downsides of irrationality in the community. Have you guys been following Richard Murdoch in the news? And if you read atheist blogs at all, you know who this jerk guy is. His quote, "I've struggled with it myself for a long time, but I came to realize that life is that gift from God. And even when life begins in that horrible situation of rape, that it's something that God intended to happen." This man did not set out to be a complete and utter asshole. This man cares about people. He cares about lives. He cares about suffering. But because he's got a whole bunch of bad ideas, it makes him into a bad person. So it's not just enough to say, oh, they mean well. You have to be able to show how your beliefs are true, and you have to at least demonstrate some care that what you believe is true. How many of you have heard religious people you know say, well, it's my beliefs, it's personal, it's not something that should concern anyone whether it's true or not? How many of you have heard that? Exactly. But it does matter. And it's time for atheists to stop accepting that whenever it's said and stop ending the conversation there and start saying, no, it does matter what you believe. And it does matter that you're rational and reasonable. And it matters for every single person on this planet. Here's another example of irrationality gone bad. I'll get it. Irrationality is not something that religions have the monopoly on. Joseph Stalin was an atheist, and he was irrational. Now, his irrationalities were political. He had a bunch of bad political ideas, but that doesn't change the fact that being irrational caused him to be a monster. And that's how atheists can decry people like Joseph Stalin the same way we decry people like George W. Bush. Because it's not enough to us that we're just atheists. I mean, that's why we're the skeptical community, right? We're agents of reason. And wherever people fail to do that, that's when they draw our ire. And whenever atheists do it, we should also be mad at them. But the problem with religion, and I'll get to that in a second, the problem with religion is that it's the only institution on the planet that tells people that it's okay to be unreasonable, that it's noble to be irrational so long as you call it faith. It's the only group spreading that idea. Let's talk about Stalin real quick. I'm going to detour here real quick because I hear Stalin over and over and over again. I just want to take a moment and debunk this. He killed a lot of people. He was kind of a jerk about that. He killed factions within his own Communist Party. He killed Finns. He killed Karelians. He killed Ukrainians. He killed 35,000 military officers in his own army. All of the Bolsheviks who played prominent roles in the Russian Revolution killed thousands of writers, intellectuals, and artists. 141 American communists. Lots of people regardless of religion. How does this make sense if atheism was the driving factor behind what Stalin did? Why would he kill all these people? And not only would he kill all those people, regardless of religion, after the Germans attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, Stalin revived the Orthodox Church. Because you only need to glance at the anti-gay legislation being fomented from the pulpit here in the United States to see what a powerful political player a church can be. And when Stalin cracked down on the church initially, it's because they were a political player who backed the wrong political horse. But once they came around, Stalin revived the church. He allowed the church leaders at the time of the Orthodox Church to convene a council where they elected Sergius, the patriarch of Moscow and all of Russia. The theological schools in the country were reopened under Stalin's watch, and this included the Moscow Academy Seminary, which had been closed since 1918. And between 1945 and 1959, which was Stalin's rule, the organization of the church was greatly expanded. How much so? From 500 churches up to 25,000 by 1959. In fact, by 1957, 22,000 of them were considered active. How does this make sense if he killed for atheism? It doesn't. It makes none. This argument is silly, and I just wanted that on YouTube so people can show it to Christians because it annoys me. All right. So if you agree that being reasonable is a moral obligation, and I hope no one watching this video on YouTube or nobody in this audience would ever say otherwise. I mean, who's going to say, no, I don't think it's a good thing to be reasonable. I'm going to walk out of my house through the second-story window. There's nothing you can do for them at that point. But for the people who cherish reason and realize that it's a moral and personal obligation, we can talk about how this affects our morality. What follows morally once we realize that we have to be reasonable? Well, questions of morals are questions of what we ought to do. And what we ought to do is informed by the facts of the universe. And now the response you'll get to this is you can't get an ought from an is. How many of you have heard that one? No? Oh, you guys need to be on the internet more. You can't get an ought from an is, but you can. You do it all the time, and I'll prove it to you. If you want to smell good, you ought to take a shower. Now, of course, a few things there have to be true. You must want to be clean, and the shower must not melt off your skin or have some other deleterious effect. But as long as those two things are true, you ought to take a shower. If you want your car to run, you ought to change the oil. All questions of ought are stemmed from a question of desire. If you want X, you should do Y and Z. So in order to figure out what we ought to do morally, we have to figure out what desire morality satisfies in us. And there's a simple, obvious answer. We all want to be happy. It's what informs every decision we make. It's why we all have shit jobs we hate, because we'd rather have food on the table and a roof over our head and suffer through work to have those things. So we can start talking about what makes us happy reasonable. And even religious people behave this way, because you must want to follow God. I mean, if you can't appeal to someone's desire to obey God, what can you do? I mean, this is why they try to create a heaven that everybody wants to go to and a hell that nobody wants to go to. Once you take that away from them, what power do they have to make you follow God? How can they appeal to you? And you can even push religious people on this. You can say, if you found out today that obeying the 10 Commandments is what lands you in hell, and disobeying them was what got you into heaven, how would their behavior change? I've never had a believer say they wouldn't start disobeying the 10 Commandments to get into heaven, because they're doing what they think will make them happy. They're doing what they think will get them what they want the most, which is what it means to make a decision. The response we hear to this is that biological process has no authority to tell you what to do, which is debatable. But even if I were to agree with that statement, biological process tell us what we want, and what we do will always naturally follow from that. Okay, the response then will be, well, what about psychos? Aren't they just doing what they want? And yes, they are. Now, it raises an interesting question about a God who would put people on the planet who crave violence and death. You know, it's like making human beings with hunger and commanding them not to eat. It's just be kind of a silly thing for God to do. But they are doing what they think will make them happy. But then so are we. When we realize that people are so devoid of compassion that they're scarcely human anymore, we separate them from society. We lock them up. We get away from them, which is what we see in every society, people trying to manage people like that. But then the response will be, doesn't that mean that might makes right? And whoever is strongest then gets to make all the rules? And the answer is yes and no. Strength is not an individual proposition. Like if I were to mix it up with Aaron Raw there in the back, I'm pretty sure he would stomp me into last Tuesday. He's got about a foot on me. But if we have a society of 10 people and Aaron tries to throw his weight around, well, the other 9 of us are going to gang up and stomp him into last Tuesday. Strength can be a societal factor, and indeed it is. We've run studies with rhesus monkeys where we'll put them all in a cage where they have to pull a lever that will shock one of their cage mates in order to get fed. And when we do that, the monkeys will start starving themselves. They'll starve themselves for up to 14 days at times to prevent hurting one of their cage mates. Now, those monkeys don't believe in God. What makes them behave that way? Whatever it is, it's part of their makeup. It's part of their DNA that we share. Compassion for others, empathy for others. Once you realize that we have that, unless you're a psychotic, that's all the motivation you need to be good to others, because you realize that your happiness is tied to theirs. So even if you're just wanting to be happy on an individual level, approach it reasonably. What will make you more happy? If you're a dick to other people, you're going to have fewer friends. You're going to be welcome in fewer places. You'll have to remember what lies you've told. You'll have more enemies. You'll have more troubles. You become the type of person that you'd hate. Now, I've had stuff stolen from me before, so I know what it feels like to hate the person who stole my things. And what that tells me is if I were to steal, I would necessarily become the type of person I would hate. I would have no choice but to hate myself. That's no way to live happily in life. In fact, we've done countless studies showing that people who do steal do, for the most part, self-loathe and are less happy. If you're a jerk to other people, you'll be trusted less, and other people won't want to treat you well. Essentially, life would suck if you're not good to other people. Once you realize that life would suck if everybody went around killing their neighbors, murdering their pets, and stealing their pornography, that is all the motivation you need to create social rules to protect your own happiness by protecting everyone else's. There's a reason smiles are contagious. There's a reason when we see bloody scenes in horror movies, we recoil and go, ugh. Because we have empathy, and our happiness is dependent upon taking care of everyone else. So while we may not know with perfect certainty what makes people the most happy, this is not an empty proposition where we can't find any objective facts whatsoever, the way apologists will tell us with the moral argument. I mean, I've heard apologists say that without God telling us right or wrong, the Holocaust is a mere matter of opinion. Who's going to sit here and argue that the Holocaust could possibly lead to greater human happiness than not genociding people? Well, Christian apologists. And what's more, even if I admitted that, your argument can't be that humanity is so corrupt, so evil, that we need a God for a role model. We need a lawgiver who gave us Old Testament barbarity. Exodus 35:2, kill people for working on Saturday. If you believe the Bible is true, at minimum, you have to believe there was a time when that was moral. And it never was. There was never a time when humanity couldn't do better than that piece of barbarity. And there's plenty more like it, just like it in the Old Testament. Or the idea that belief is more important than compassion. To listen to most Christians, someone like Osama bin Laden, the bloodthirsty killer, could have a deathbed conversion and wind up in heaven, where most of the people in this room who have been good to everybody they've ever met, who have been charitable, who have cared for the destitute, and who have felt sympathy every time someone suffered, will go to hell. There is not an ounce of justice in that idea. Or even the idea of hell, of being punished eternally for your honest opinion, regardless of whether or not you're a compassionate human being. There's this idea amongst many religious people, and even some atheists, that we need to respect the beliefs of others because they're cherished by those people. There is no universe where we should not make it a point to reject all of this, not only as irrational, but as hugely and unforgivably immoral at every opportunity. Does belief in God make people better? No. Next slide. Our prisons are full of religious people. It has not made them better. But even the premise of Christianity is thoroughly immoral, and I'll explain that. What is the basic premise of Christianity? That you have to choose to believe in Jesus. How many of you have been admonished to choose to believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Can't do it. Can't do it. You don't choose your beliefs. Your beliefs are a function of whatever information is rattling around inside your skull, and you are powerless to do anything else. And if you don't believe me, try walking up to the roof of this building and walking up to the edge and trying to convince yourself by force of will that gravity doesn't work. There's not a single person in this room who can do that because your mind is already made up for you. And if God exists, he made you with that mind, a mind that's bound to reason, a mind that doesn't want to be taken advantage of. And then what did he do as the gateway to heaven? He demanded that you believe someone rose from the dead. How fair is that? To give you a mind that's incapable of choosing to believe things and then to demand that you do. Or even the idea that absolute morality can exist. This is what you'll hear from the apologists. You know, if society makes up moral rules, then absolute morality can exist. But even in religion, absolute morality doesn't exist. And if it does, it's immoral. Never lie. Thou shalt not lie. The classic example, if you're in Nazi Germany and the Gestapo are knocking on your door asking if you're harboring Jews, the moral thing to do is to lie your ass off. If stealing will prevent someone from dying, you steal. This is not up for debate. There is no situation where some blanket moral rule applies all the time, and it doesn't matter if the Bible says otherwise. Okay, so we have this moral obligation to be reasonable. We have a rational approach to morality that doesn't require a God at all, and if it does, that God is immoral. Is religion reasonable? Because if you believe that being reasonable is a moral obligation, if religion is unreasonable, and you are aware that it's unreasonable, to continue to believe it is immoral. Now, I could just start out pointing out that people don't rise from the dead and be done with it, but I'm going to go through some of the things you'll actually hear. How many of you heard someone tell you that God speaks to them, or they speak to God and God speaks back? I believe they're sincere. I believe they really do think that God is talking to them and sending them messages. But even if you believe that, ask yourself who God really speaks to. Or more importantly, start out with asking yourself, who does God not speak to? Well, he doesn't speak to every Hindu, despite their protestations to the contrary. God can't be speaking to them because Christianity is true. God doesn't speak to every pagan, everybody who believes in any god going back through the history of humanity, who all thought the gods were speaking to them, weren't happening. Every Muslim going back to the 7th century, God wasn't speaking to them either. Essentially, God did not speak to every other believer of every other religion throughout all of history. And this makes up a majority of the people who ever lived. Christians are a fairly small portion of the overall total of religious people. Who else did God not speak to? God did not speak to Andrea Yates, the Christian woman who drowned her children because she heard God telling her to do so. God did not speak to Daphne Spurlock, who slit her son's throat at the behest of the Christian God's voice. He couldn't have spoken to them. These people were monsters. They killed their children. That's not true Christianity. God did not speak to Torquemada during the Crusades. He didn't speak to the Newmans who watched their daughter die of type 1 diabetes. So who did God speak to? He spoke to Abraham. Clearly, God can tell you to kill your children, just not those people. They weren't true Christians. God spoke to Jephthah when he made him immolate his daughter. Not to Daphne Yates or Andrea Spurlock. And apparently God spoke to whatever Christian you happen to be talking to at the time. Even if you are a Christian and you think God speaks to you, even if you were to hear God's voice, what could you conclude? The starting probability that God is actually speaking to you compared to all of these people who are either lying, delusional, or crazy is very, very low. Is it more likely that God is actually speaking to you, or that you are falling victim to the same flaw in psychology that allowed all of these people to believe the exact same thing in error? Because clearly, if you go back to other Christians and sects that aren't yours, or to the Christians who did horrible things, even Christians can think God's speaking to them and have no idea and be wrong. Why aren't you? The take-home of this is that it's not merely enough when someone kills their kid because Jesus told them to say, no, my beliefs are different. If you believe that God spoke to Abraham, but not to any of those other people, it's not just enough to say that your beliefs are different. You have to be able to show that your beliefs are more reasonable. Otherwise, you're no better, and you're certainly no better in the eyes of society. And the thing is, we're not holding Christians to that standard. Whenever we get the line, oh, those people aren't true Christians, or that doesn't represent true Christianity, we're nodding our head, saying, yes, those beliefs are different. But in doing so, we're accepting the premise, sure, your beliefs are more likely to be true, which isn't the case. And that's where morality lies in that question, and we need to start holding them to that. I'm not getting as many Darwins as Jerry. My talk's less exuberant. How many of you have heard this one? I feel God. I feel God's presence. Jerry, have you ever had that happen? Once or twice. All right. Once more, I believe they're sincere, just as sincere as the people who think God speaks to them. But here's the deal. Your senses can deceive you. Go ask Aaron Raw about this. He'll tell you all the ways science is constructed to get around the flaws in human perception. And this is the whole reason that optical illusions can exist. Square A and square B of this image are the exact same color, and I'll prove it to you. Yeah? Now, I've done this before, and people have said, but the square changed color as it went through there. Let's try it again. Watch this. They're the same color, and when I take them away again, they'll still strike you as different colors. Because your brains are flawed, which says a lot to the person who created them if you accept that premise. But everything our senses tell us is not necessarily true. This is how magicians make their living. Right? Even if you feel God's presence, ask yourself what is more reasonably likely that God, who wants a relationship with you, is choosing to communicate to you in this incredibly fuzzy way that creates all this religious confusion that allows Muslims to claim the same religious experience as you, or that feeling fuzzy and happy is just what happens when you think about God naturally in the brain. I'd be willing to think that someday we'll be able to confirm that the feeling kids have when they think about Santa Claus is the same type of religious experience people get when they pray. One of those is more reasonably likely, and it's obvious, or it should be obvious, which it is. If God wants to communicate with you, he can do better than in some way that's indistinguishable from fuzzy feelings created elsewhere and in other religions. But there's always a trump card, isn't there? No matter what, no matter how reasonable it is, I believe through faith. And if you believe that reason is a moral obligation, whenever you cite faith, there's a question every Christian, every Muslim, every religious person should immediately have to answer. Can you distinguish faith from gullibility? Is there any idea in the entire universe so ludicrous, so flagrantly at odds with reality, that faith can't be advanced in its defense? And if not, this is a pretty crappy way to get to conclusions about anything. Faith, as Aaron said, I think I've pronounced your name 3 different ways during the course of this talk, so I've never asked you how. How is it pronounced? Aaron. That's what I meant. Like Aaron said in his talk, faith is the antithesis of reason. If reason could allow you to believe that gravity works, and you can cite faith to believe, oh, gravity doesn't work, then faith has become the enemy of reason. And as so many prominent philosophers have said, where we have reason, we don't need faith. If you ask me to defend my shoe size, or that the sun will rise in the east tomorrow, I'm not going to cite faith, because I have reasons for those things. It's only when we don't have reasons that faith can, or when the reasons work in direct opposition to your beliefs, that faith is even necessary. And if you believe that reason is a moral obligation, you're being immoral by citing faith. And especially when faith doesn't work for everybody else. I mean, sure, faith gets you to the truth, but what about all these other people? Faith is a repository for error at... Faith is a repository of error for everybody else. Why isn't it a repository of error for you? So, let's talk about what reason can tell us about the universe. And because it's frankly incompatible with literally every religious belief out there. For one, if the universe is consistent, we can figure out how it works. And don't let any creationist tell you otherwise. Science makes one assumption about the universe, and only one: that the universe operates under a consistent set of rules. And if that's true, we should be able to determine what they are. Every time we watch a stone fall and measure its rate of descent, every time we throw a satellite to the edge of the universe, or to the edge of the universe, edge of the solar system, and hit something the size of a pinhead, we're testing that assumption, and it works. And it works so well that at this time, anybody even suggesting that science is a matter of faith should be told to take a direct hike. And even religious people behave this way in every other way outside of their religion. How many religious people do you know will walk by a hot stove one week and burn their hand on it, and walk back the next week and put their hand on the same stove? Nobody, because they acknowledge the world operates under a set of rules. You have to in order to get around. It's only when science conflicts with religion that things get a little messed up. So if the universe is consistent, how does it look? Does it look designed? And the answer is no. How many of you have heard the argument that the universe is so complex, so ordered, there has to be a God, there had to be a God? Aaron's hand was like, Snowflakes. More complex, more ordered than liquid water. Yet nobody feels the need to invoke a snowflake-making God because we know the natural processes that produce that order all by themselves. And the same is true of stars. The Bible says on the fourth day God made all the stars. Well, no, he didn't. We know the processes that make the stars. It's called the genes instability. And no appeal whatsoever is necessary. You just need a big enough cloud of hydrogen that gravity can start to pull it together. They'll spike the temperature in the center, and you'll get a hugely complex star out of a very uncomplex cloud of hydrogen. And from evolution to the genes instability to snowflakes, there are so many ways in which we've determined how the universe creates order all by itself. Now, are there some we haven't figured out? Sure. I mean, there was a time when we hadn't explained anything. But ever since that time, everything we have explained, literally everything, has turned out to be the product of mindless forces acting upon inanimate objects. All of them. So for the ones we haven't explained yet, which horse do you back? I mean, if you have two boxers who have fought millions of fights and one boxer's won every single one of them, and they're about to fight again, which boxer do you bet your life savings on? If you look at the historical trend of discovered knowledge, it's obvious. We're finding natural explanations for everything when we apply reason. We're not finding God. We never have. And at this point, there's no reason to believe that we ever will. But is science compatible with religion? Well, the escape will be that these two things ask different questions. But that's not true. Biologists, like Richard Dawkins here, have something to say about people rising from the dead. Physicists have something to say about the idea that someone could walk on water. Chemists might have a bone to pick with the idea that a human body could be converted to a pillar of salt. Geologists may take issue with the idea of a global flood that left no evidence whatsoever. And even if geologists don't take exception with that flood, historians who know that civilizations like Egypt's 6th dynasty, who are around during that time, left copious records of their civilizations, somehow without noticing dying, they might have something to say about it. The questions religious people ask are scientific questions. They are questions that reason has a right to inform upon. They just get the wrong answers. And unless a religious person is willing to challenge the scientific community, in peer review, not just getting their asses handed to them by Aaron back there. Did you say? Are you fucking with me? Someone's on my shit list. And I added this slide later today when I heard Teresa McBain talking about not fearing change, about how it kept her in quite literally a prison of her own mind for most of her life, thinking that change was the voice of the devil and that was sin. And I'm making a direct appeal to religious people on YouTube. If you believe you have a moral obligation to be reasonable, then it applies to your religion. You are more knowledgeable than you were 2 years ago. You're infinitely more knowledgeable than you were a decade ago. Your knowledge changes, and you find out that you were wrong about all kinds of things, and sometimes things that were important to you. People can have religious irrationalities that turn out to produce the death of their daughters, that turn out to produce wars, that turn out to drag civilizations into the abyss. Make sure that yours aren't one of them. You may have the correct religion. There may be a correct religion out there. But you won't know, and you won't be moral, and you'll live in a personal hell of fear in the one life you're guaranteed until you apply reason to your religion the way you do to everything else. And the same goes to atheists, with your politics, with everything that governs your life. How many of us have been victims of our own irrationality, even though we're atheists? If you didn't raise your hand, you're a liar and you're going to hell. And it all could have been avoided had we been more rational. Now, the problem with religion is that it sometimes, and I say sometimes very generously, convinces people they don't need to make the effort to be rational. They've already found the truth. And we've seen all the talks today about how religious people can put their fingers in their ears and say, la, 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 not listening. It's not enough just to say that that's demeaning to them or that it's not right. It's time for us to stand up and say what you're doing is a violation of your obligation to me as your neighbor and as your teammate here on planet Earth. And it is not only irrational, it is immoral. So what's the take home from this? Well, first off, there's no God. And that's okay. Imagine a world where no God exists. What would it look like? Pretty much like the one we live in. And this life ain't so bad. It's like I said earlier, there are real heavens and real hells out there, but it's not some place in the clouds, and it's not at the center of the earth with dudes with pitchforks. It's the heavens and the hells that we make for ourselves in this lifetime. And if you spend it not being in love with who you want, or not dancing, or not playing video games, or listening to rock and roll music that sounds good to you, if you live your life not pursuing what makes you happy, you're at least infringing on your own happiness. And in the cases of people like Jerry and Teresa who become so trapped by this bubble, you're creating your own personal hell. Don't do that. Life, any happiness, doesn't have to be permanent just to be meaningful. This conference is going to end, and I'm having a blast. Pursuing happiness. Pursuing happiness is the whole point of life. And if you let religion stop that, either for you or by being unreasonable for anybody else, you're a detriment to the human condition. And that's where my interest in your religion extends. I'm a firebrand atheist. I'm angry all the time. I write a blog about it. I've always had a fascination with astronomy. I grew up in Mountain Home, Arkansas, which is about 2 or 3 hours up north of here. Bombers, anyone? I hate that team. And I remember back home on summer nights, it was a small town, very little light pollution. I'd be able to lay in my backyard and look up at the sky, and I'd spend nights out there just looking at the stars. And because I was religious, I thought to myself, this is how I'm communing with God. God made the stars, and this is me understanding and appreciating them. And then I went to college and audited astronomy courses, and I learned about the gene's instability. And I learned how to look at the universe in terms of logarithmic functions in a way that would let me grasp its vastness in some way that my imagination couldn't. And when I look at the stars now, they're so much more beautiful. And I realized that when I was young, I was totally ignorant of them. And I had named my ignorance of them God. And I had come to appreciate my ignorance in that way. And I lost time appreciating.
It's okay.
No, it's not. I'm a man. Man up. And I lost time appreciating this thing that has come to mean so much to me. And I regret it. And I regret opposing gay rights when I was that young, which made perfect sense given my ignorances. If you're a religious person watching this talk and you believe that you have a moral obligation to be reasonable, don't do it just for all the people that you might harm through your unreason. Do it for yourself to learn how to appreciate this world and make the most of the one life you are given. You owe that to yourself, and religion may very well be taking it away from you. They might not, but you'll never know until you attack it with reason to be sure. And if your religion is true, it should stand up to that. And if you conclude that your religion is not reasonable, and you keep believing it, it's not a matter of your personal religious beliefs. It's not a matter of, we can agree to disagree. You are failing morally. And it's my business, and it's the business of every other person you will ever interact with. Thank you.